Hey, Inside Out, how are we doing tonight? Awesome. Hey, Debbie, I see you. Awesome. Well, my name is Klein. I'm a senior here at Inside Out. I just want to say thanks for being here one more time. I know what it feels like to have a ton of homework on the weekend, so thanks for being here, hanging out with us. As you just saw right up there in our video, we are continuing the series Rhythm, which I don't know what's going on. We are continuing the series called Rhythm, which we kicked off last week. And throughout this series, what we are going to be talking about is the idea of connection. We're going to be talking about different things that can help with connection and different things that can hinder our connection throughout this series. So Jordan Geist, our Inside Out director, if you were here last week, he kicked off this series for us. And there's two things that he mentioned that I want to revisit really fast before we jump in tonight, if that's okay with y'all. One thing that he started with last week was he said the rhythms of our life are what connect us to one another. In other words, our routines, our personalities, things that are unique to us, help us connect with people around us. Another thing that Jordan talked about last week that I want to revisit is this right up here. He said that we all need to be known by someone. That's human nature. Humans are hardwired to desire connection. This is why we want friends. This is why we want followers. This is why we want likes. This is why we like talking to people, because we all have a natural desire to feel connected to the people around us. Now, tonight I'm going to be introducing a new tool that I think can really help when it comes to our connection with other people around us. Now, a lot of the content I'm going to be going through tonight and talking about tonight comes from this lady right up here named Brene Brown. How many of you in here have heard of Brene Brown? You may know her from like Oprah. That's where my mom knew her from. But Brene Brown is an incredible lady. She's a researcher. She has her PhD in social work. I have no idea what is going on with this thing, but bear with me, please. So Brene Brown's a researcher. She's an incredible lady, PhD in social work, and she has tons of books out there, tons of messages where she talks about different things that help with human connection, different elements of human connection. In fact, Brene Brown has a TED Talk that went viral in 2010. I think it has like 44 million views, where she talks about this one thing that will help with connection. And the one thing that she talks about and how she discovered that was basically, she talks about this in her TED Talk, she conducted a case study for like 6 years. And she interviewed people after people. She sat down with people, heard their stories. She conducted a ton of research. And then she stepped back from that research and that pool of people that she had interviewed. And out of that pool, she pulled out people who she felt lived a wholehearted life. So she looked at this group of people. She pulled out ones that she felt lived a wholehearted life, people that were fully alive, people that did this connection thing great. And then she looked at that pool of people and said, what do these people have in common? What is the common theme throughout them? And she looked and she sat and she researched for years. She ends up writing a book about it that we'll talk about later. And the one idea that was common throughout this group of people is that every one of them was vulnerable or embraced vulnerability. They believed what made them vulnerable also made them beautiful. And that was common throughout all of these interviews, all of these stories, all of the research that she did with this group of people. Now, before I talk more about vulnerability, before we jump into this tonight, I just thought I had to be vulnerable with you guys first. So I'm going to reintroduce myself. I have some vulnerable statements about myself I don't necessarily want to admit, but I had some friends help me write these, and it's right up here. So my name is Klein. I would say I'm an aspiring singer that refuses to sing, so I tell people I can sing, but then I don't ever sing in front of them. I'm the last pick in the 2019 Newcomb Games. If you don't know what Newcomb is, Google it. And if you're wondering which game, almost everyone that I played. I'm a Round Rock volleyball alum, not because I graduated, and I will throw up at or before 1 mile. Running is just not my thing, and my body's natural way of telling me that is making me throw up every time I run. I'm a bad driver who thinks she's good. I had some friends help me write this, so I'm not really happy about some of those on the list, but I let them stay anyways. So those are some vulnerable statements, but in all seriousness, we are talking about this idea of vulnerability tonight. And a lot of the content, like I said, comes from Brene Brown, but a lot of it comes from a book that she wrote, this one specifically, Daring Greatly. Have any of you guys heard of this book? Daring Greatly? Okay, a couple of people. So in this book, she talks about this idea of vulnerability and how it can help us. I really have no idea what's going on, but it's okay. We're going to keep going through it. Okay, so she talks about this idea of vulnerability and how it can connect us better to the people around us. Now, when I first started reading this book, honestly, I was a little terrified because when I think about vulnerability, the first thought that pops in my mind, and maybe this is true for you, is that vulnerability equals weakness. When I think about vulnerability, some of the words that pop in my head, I think of being afraid, being scared, being uncomfortable, being nervous. Those are the moments when I think about being vulnerable. So naturally, as humans, a lot of us throw up shields against vulnerability. We throw up shields so that we don't have to be vulnerable. And tonight, I want to talk about two of the shields that are common for a lot of us to throw up when we don't want to be vulnerable. The first one is this right up here. Common shields of vulnerability, number one, suppressing emotions. So it's natural for every single one of us when we start to feel vulnerable to start to try to suppress that. But as humans, we don't have the capability to just suppress one emotion. So we have a lot of emotions that we feel at once often. So if you're feeling like 10 different things at once, and one of them is vulnerability, and you want to suppress that one thing, well, we're unable to just suppress that one thing, so we end up suppressing a lot of great things alongside of that. So if you start to suppress vulnerability, sometimes you'll suppress joy, and you'll suppress happiness, or you'll suppress some of the other great things that you want to feel alongside vulnerability. So to represent this, I have this huge brick up here, because sometimes when we try to suppress vulnerability and we try to suppress those other emotions, we end up kind of being like an emotional brick. We don't have a lot of emotion behind us because we started to suppress some of the good things along with it. Now, I would try to pick this up, but I did it during run through and I almost dropped it on my foot, so I'm not going to do that. The second shield that we throw up to vulnerability as humans, and it's natural for a lot of us, is this one right up here. It's oversharing. This is the idea that we want people to think we're being vulnerable, so sometimes we overshare. So we want people to think of us as like an open book. So we start to share everything about us the first time we meet someone. But that's not authentic. That's not vulnerability. This is the idea that someone in the room told a story, and you feel this like inner need to kind of one-up them. So you think of your own story, or you over-exaggerate a story that you have in your mind, and you tell that because you want people to look at you as vulnerable. So over here to represent that, I have this mask right up here. Because a lot of times we want people to look at us differently, and we want them to think we're being vulnerable, but really we're just trying to hide the things that we don't want to be vulnerable about. So those are two of the most common shields that we as humans throw up sometimes when it comes to vulnerability. But the bad thing about hanging in this area, and the bad thing about doing these two things, suppressing emotion and oversharing, is a lot of times, if we're not being vulnerable, it keeps us from experiencing a lot of the great things that come along with vulnerability. Vulnerability is at the core of a lot of great emotions that we want to experience in life. So when we choose to not be vulnerable or suppress vulnerability, we miss out on those things. I mean, when you think about it, you can't truly fall in love if you can't be vulnerable. If you can't let someone know who you truly are, and you can't see who they truly are, you can't fall in love. You can't truly be known if you aren't vulnerable. If you don't let people see you for who you really are, you won't be known. You can't feel like you belong if people don't know the real you. If you're hanging out with friends and you let them know kind of an alternative version of you, they won't ever know the true you, so you won't feel like you belong. You won't know real joy. You won't show appreciation or gratitude. When you want to let people know how grateful you are for them or how thankful you are for what they've done, if you can't let them see why that was so important to you, then you won't be able to do those two things. So there's a lot of great things that we miss out on as a result of vulnerability. So tonight what I want to talk about is the alternative to that. How can we be vulnerable? What does vulnerability really look like? And what is vulnerability? And so to do that, I want to take a look at a couple of different stories in the Bible where this theme of vulnerability is consistent throughout. I mean, when we think back, all the way back to the beginning, we think Adam and Eve. If you haven't heard the story of Adam and Eve, basically when God created man and woman, and he gave them one rule, and he said, don't eat the fruit on the tree, and guess what they did? They ate the fruit on the tree, if you don't know the story. But tonight, the idea of vulnerability is in that story, and it's really easy to miss. And tonight, I want to look at the beginning of that. It starts off like this. It says, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Now, it's really easy when you've read the story, if you've read it before and you just kind of passed up on this, is before sin enters the story, before they disobeyed the one command that God had given them, they were vulnerable. I mean, this was before clothes, so they were naked, they were vulnerable. But there was no problem with that. That didn't make them uncomfortable. But as soon as sin enters the story, they tell themselves that vulnerability is a bad thing. And all of a sudden, they start to hide from God. They start to shy away from God. It continues on in the same chapter. It says, then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man, and he said, where are you? And it finishes right there. In the next verse, it says, he answered, I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. Which is so interesting because, like I said before, they weren't afraid until sin enters the story and distorts how they saw vulnerability. All of a sudden, something that was good, they saw as bad. And something that was bad for them, they saw as good. Another example in the Bible of when vulnerability was a theme throughout, where it was a good thing. I mean, when we think about Jesus, when he came down to earth, he was the most vulnerable he had ever been. When he kind of walked in and stepped into human form, and he stepped into all the persecution and everything people were saying about him, I mean, he was vulnerable. He was vulnerable to being hurt. He was vulnerable to being persecuted. He ended up dying on a Roman cross in the most vulnerable way. When we step into a relationship with Christ, think about how vulnerable that decision is. To say, you know what, I don't have it all together, and I need someone else. I need you, Jesus, because you can help me, and I can't do it on my own. I need a Savior. That's an incredibly vulnerable statement. So this idea of vulnerability is woven throughout, and it's a heavy theme throughout a lot of different stories that we've heard before. As we continue on, though, I want to put a little bit more language around what vulnerability actually is. Brené Brown describes and defines vulnerability as this. She says it's uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. But vulnerability is not weakness. It's our most accurate measure of courage, which I think is so interesting. She relates vulnerability to courage, and she says it's not weakness, even though sometimes we feel like it may be. There's a list in her book as well where she gives examples of what vulnerability looks like. She says vulnerability is sharing an unpopular opinion, standing up in a room full of people who believe the exact opposite of you and saying, this is what I believe. Vulnerability is standing up for yourself, asking for help, expressing your emotions first, trying something new, admitting you're afraid, asking for forgiveness, presenting your ideas. I want to revisit this one too. Expressing your emotions first. Have you ever seen someone, maybe you want to be friends with them, or you like them, or you want to be around them, but it's like awkward and society tells you don't approach them or don't talk to them if you're not friends with them yet. But vulnerability is doing that. It's stepping into that moment, stepping into the moment that you can't control, and kind of risking it anyways. So up on stage, I have some boxing gloves to represent vulnerability. Because vulnerability truly is the moment when you step into the arena and it gets messy and risky and you can't control the outcome and you say, I'm still going to choose to show up and I'm still going to choose to be vulnerable and I'm still going to choose to do those things. Now, I want to tell a story Brené Brown has told before where it's an incredible story where she relates vulnerability to something else, and it's not weakness. She actually was in a room just like this. She was talking to a group of Marines, and she asked them, can you be brave, can you be courageous if you're not vulnerable? And for me, I used to say, well, yeah, of course you can, because I was relating vulnerability to weakness. But it's really interesting because when she stands in the room of Marines, they say the exact opposite. They said, absolutely not. How can you be brave? How can you be courageous if you're not vulnerable? There has to be something else on the line. When these Marines are out in the battlefield and they have a buddy to the left and the right of them that they're defending, they are vulnerable in that moment. They're risking their lives for the people around them. That's the definition of vulnerability, being courageous when you can't control the outcome. They said, of course you have to be vulnerable to be brave and to be courageous, which I think is so interesting because, like I said earlier, a lot of us in the room think of vulnerability as weakness. But the Marines, like they just said, they relate that to bravery and to courageous. And that's why when we, as a society, lose our capacity to be vulnerable, it's dangerous because although vulnerability is the core of shame, fear, and our struggle for worthiness, it also appears to be the birthplace of joy, creativity, belonging, love. Although vulnerability to us sometimes represents weakness and it's scary, it's at the core of a lot of positive emotions that we desire, a lot of positive experiences that we desire. So when we walk away from vulnerability, we try to put a shield up against vulnerability, we're missing out on some of the exact things that we desire in life. Now, I want to revisit this idea that I talked about earlier, the idea that vulnerability is not oversharing. It's not emotional throw up, emotional vomit. Like you're just saying, hey, here's everything about me. I know you just met me 5 minutes ago, but I'm gonna tell you my life story. Because vulnerability, when it doesn't come from an authentic place, actually does the opposite. Brené Brown has an incredible quote in one of her books, and I would try to paraphrase it and just say it in my own words, but she says it 10 times better. So I'm just gonna read it. It's a little bit long, but hang with me because it's incredible. She says, vulnerability is based on mutuality and requires boundaries and trust. It's not oversharing, it's not purging, it's not indiscriminate disclosure, it's not celebrity-style social media information dumps. In other words, it's not an Instagram post that has 5 pages about everything going on in your life at once. Vulnerability is about sharing our feelings and our experiences with people who have earned the right to hear them. Being vulnerable and open is mutual and an integral part of the trust-building process. And it continues on, and it says, we can't always have guarantees in place before we risk sharing. However, we don't bare our souls the first time we meet someone. We don't lead with and start with, hi, my name is Brene, and here's my deepest, darkest struggle. That's not vulnerability. That may be desperation or woundedness or even attention-seeking, but it's not vulnerability. And then she finishes, she says, why? Because sharing appropriately with boundaries means sharing with people with whom we've developed relationships that can bear the weight of our story. The result of this mutually respectful vulnerability is increased connection, trust, and engagement. And then it ends like this. It says, vulnerability without boundaries leads to disconnection, distrust, and disengagement. In fact, boundaryless disclosure is one way we protect ourselves from real vulnerability. In other words, when we overshare, when we want people to think we're being vulnerable for the wrong reasons and using that to hide what we are truly vulnerable about, it does the exact opposite. It doesn't help with connection. It leads to disconnection. So what does this mean for us? I would say that leaves us with 3 choices that we talked about. It leads us with 2 different shields. We can choose to suppress vulnerability, avoid it at all costs, and as a result, start to suppress all of the good things that we all desire in life. That's one option. Another one is we can choose to hide behind a mask. So we can overshare. We can meet people, and the first time we meet them, we share everything about us. We can post stuff on Instagram all the time, trying to let on this image that we are being vulnerable. But in reality, we hide behind that to avoid true vulnerability. Or we can step into the arena. We can be courageous. We can risk it all, even when we don't know the outcome. And yes, this option is messy, and yes, sometimes it is terrifying, but it leads to so many great things, and it leads to us feeling more connected. Now, for me personally, vulnerability is actually like my greatest nightmare, which I think makes it kind of ironic that I'm sitting up here talking about it, because I'm not the best at it. With my personality, I'm an Enneagram 3. Any Enneagram 3s, have you taken the test? Anyone know if there are 3? Okay, a couple people. So I'm an Enneagram 3, and by nature, my gut reaction is I want people to see me for my performance and what I put out there, but not who I really am. So I don't like to be vulnerable. I don't want people to see me for who I actually am. Instead, I want to put out things. I want to get a good grade, or I want to perform good in a game, and I want them to see that about me, which is really dangerous, because when I get a bad grade or when I don't perform how I want to, well, then I think, okay, that makes me a bad person. Everybody hates me. My life's falling apart. I have those moments like 3 times a week. But I end up having that be the image that people see of me. I don't let people in all the time because I'm afraid of what they'll think of me. Now, this idea I've been dealing with for like 10 years, and the reason that I feel this way, the reason I've kind of try to rely on my performance instead of who I actually am is because of kind of how I was brought up and my upbringing in my childhood. I have an older brother named Mason. He's 4 years older than me, so he's 21. And throughout my whole life, I've always been following in his footsteps. So he's always completed the chapter that I'm about to head into. So he graduated high school right before I entered high school. He left middle school right before I entered middle school. So I was always like one step behind my brother, kind of chasing what he was doing. And I always looked to him as my example for what I need to be doing in high school. What do I need to achieve? And that became increasingly difficult as I got older because my brother was really successful at what he did. My brother's thing was baseball. So from a really young age, baseball was his thing. It came super natural to him. So he was really, really great at it from a young age. And my brother's kind of achievements over the years that I was sitting on the sidelines watching kept kind of racking up. A couple of them, this one right up here. My brother in 2013 played for USA Baseball. So he went to Bogota, Colombia, which is in South America, and he was selected to play on the USA Baseball team. He actually pitched in the gold medal game against Cuba, where they won the gold medal, so that was really cool. He has a lot of other great accomplishments in baseball. He played in the area code games in Long Beach, California, which is a big thing in the baseball world. He was a perfect game All-American. Being an All-American in any sport is a big deal. And then he ended up being the youngest recruit under Augie Garrido to be recruited for UT Baseball. So that's my brother and Augie Garrido. And there's another picture, I think, of his official visit when he went to UT. So he was the youngest recruit. His freshman year of high school, he got offered a scholarship to play baseball at the University of Texas. And I was super happy for him, super excited on the sidelines watching all these accomplishments. And from there, my brother ended up passing up his scholarship at UT because he got drafted. In the 2016 MLB draft, my brother was the 85th pick. And so I watched this in 2016. He's not in the majors yet. That was just a uniform they wear. He's still in the minors for the San Diego Padres. But I watched my brother all of these accomplishments when I was growing up. And I was so proud of him, just as my family was. But along the way, I started to notice how proud everyone in my family was about him. They always wanted to talk about him. My neighbors wanted to talk about him. My friends' parents wanted to talk about them. And so as I grew up, I started to look at what my brother was accomplishing. And I started to tell myself, well, you need to do something like that. You need to impress your parents like that. You need to impress your family. You need to impress your neighbors, your friends' parents like that. Like, you need to do something worth talking about. And so I thought for a long time, and I still do some days, that my image comes from what I can do. My image comes from my performance. And so I struggled with this for a long time. Around this time when my brother was achieving all of these things, this is what I look like. Yep. This is me as a kid. This is what I was accomplishing as a kid. It was great. So when we look at my brother and me side by side, these are all my brother's accomplishments. USA Baseball, area code games, All-American, UT scholarships, professional baseball player, and I was just really good at mud, I guess. That's all I had on my brother at the time. But honestly, from an authentic place, like, I still struggle with being vulnerable because of this. I still struggle with letting people see who I really am because of this. Because I don't want them to see me, I want them to see my performance and what I think will reflect good on me. Because for my whole life, like I said, I was following in the footsteps of my brother. And it's not from a jealous place. I love my brother and I'm proud of all of his accomplishments. It just comes from a place of comparison. And I want to feel the same success that I feel like he has felt. So over the last 10 years, I've continuously told myself that I'm not okay for just who I am, that I have to accomplish something down the road to make me valuable. And that is not, I 100% don't recommend that, because 10 times out of 10, that leads to disconnection. 10 times out of 10, that leads me to kind of shy away from being vulnerable. It leads me to shy away from vulnerability. And as a result, I've shied away from a lot of great things in life. And I've kind of stayed in these other two lanes a lot of my life because I've tried to suppress it, or I've tried to act like I'm being vulnerable when I'm not. And as a result, I've missed out on a lot of great things and felt disconnected out of a lot of great things because of this kind of myth that I've told myself over the last couple of years. But one thing that I've learned that I hope you walk away with tonight, and it's not easy, and it's something that I've learned along the way, and I'm still not great at it all, is this right up here. That in order for connection to happen, we have to allow ourselves to be seen. In order to be connected with the people around you, you have to let them see who you really are. Because if you can't be seen, you won't be able to see other people. And at the end of the day, seen people see people. You have to let people in. And it doesn't have to be everyone that you're around. You don't have to overshare and tell everyone your life story, but there has to be people that know who you really are. You have to have moments where you step into the arena and you're courageous and you risk it all. And you say, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to be courageous, I'm going to be vulnerable. I can't control the outcome, but I know that it's what's best for me, and I'm not going to shy away from it. Imagine a world where every single one of us did this, where it was just natural for us to be vulnerable. We didn't try to shield, we didn't try to shy away from vulnerability, but it made up who we are, and that we were okay with that we embraced vulnerability. Imagine a world where you had the courage to share even when it doesn't look good on you, even when you know it's not going to make you look like a great person. Imagine a world where you had the courage to sit next to someone who is prettier or skinnier or more athletic, or maybe they're TikTok famous, and you don't feel less than because you know that's not where your worth and your value comes from. You know that doesn't mean that you're less than because that's not where your value comes from. Imagine a world where you had the courage to ask for help, even when you feel like it makes you look weak. Even when you're telling yourself this lie that will make you look like you are weak. Imagine a world where you had the courage to ask for forgiveness, even when you feel like they may say no, even when you feel like you may not deserve it. Imagine a world where you had the courage to approach someone you admire and you want to know, even when society tells you not to, and that it'll be awkward. Imagine you see someone and you like them, you want to express your feelings towards them, and that's not awkward, and you just go for it, and you step into the arena, and you say, that may be messy, but I'm just going to be courageous, and I'm going to be vulnerable. Tonight, one thing I want to leave you with is just this last quote from the beginning of Brene Brown's book, Daring Greatly. It's an incredible quote. I'm working on trying to get better at this, and I want to leave it with you tonight because I really couldn't say it any better. Like I said, it's from her book, Daring Greatly, and it says this. It says, when we spend our lives waiting until we're perfect or bulletproof before we walk into the arena, we ultimately sacrifice relationships and opportunities that may not be recoverable. We miss out on a lot of great things that we all desire. We squander our precious time, and we turn our backs on our gifts, those unique contributions that only we can make. And it finishes with this. It says, perfect and bulletproof are seductive, but they don't exist in the human experience. We must walk into the arena, whatever it may be, a new relationship, an important meeting, our creative process, or a difficult family conversation, with courage and the willingness to engage. Rather than sitting on the sidelines and hurling judgment and advice, we must dare to show up and let ourselves be seen. This is vulnerability. This is daring greatly. Let's pray. Dear God, thank you so much for this place. Thank you so much for Inside Out and our groups, God. And I just pray that this resonates tonight, that when we are able to allow people to see us for who we truly are, then we are able to feel more connected, God. We're able to be known, truly known. And we're able to be loved and valued, God, and we will feel more connected as a result of letting people in. God, I pray that we have the courage to step into the arena, even when it's hard, even when it's awkward, even when we don't want to, God. I pray for an incredible night, an incredible week. I pray this all in your son's name. Amen.